Who was the first Auror? How did they come about? Who created the Auror headquarters? And what does it take to become one?
That's what you'll see in today's episode of Leaky Cauldron.
Hey wizards, how's it going? If you're new, don't be a muggle. Subscribe here, turn on notifications, leave a like, share, and comment. You can join the channel as a member for exclusive benefits, such as badges by your name, suggested emojis for the comments.
Or you can use the thanks button, and that way you make a contribution to our work here.
The wizarding world wasn't always the way we know it today. The government wasn't always the way it is. The Ministry of Magic didn't always exist.
Long before that, the one responsible for governing the magical community of Great Britain was the Council of Wizards.
The Council of Wizards was the longest-standing body to govern the magical community, existing since at least 1340. They had the form of a deliberative assembly, and the council was led by a wizard or witch who was titled as the chief. In these assemblies, they debated, proposed ideas, and made decisions for the magical community's benefit. But these decisions weren't always ideal since they reflected their times. It was the Council of Wizards that was responsible for enacting the International Statute of Secrecy in magic, which forced every magical being and magical creature to live hidden from muggles. This statute was first signed in 1689, but it was only actually put into practice in 1692.
At the same time, the Muggle government stopped being an absolute monarchy and became a parliamentary monarchy.
King James II was deposed and replaced by William II I and Mary II, who now reigned under conditions imposed by Parliament. This happened in 1688. Then in 1689, which is when the Wizards signed the International Statute of Secrecy, a very important document. The Muggles signed the Bill of Rights, which was the document that limited the king's powers, preventing him from ruling without Parliament. And that's an important detail to mention, because the Wizards' Council was already in the process of reform, transitioning to become the Ministry of Magic. And at that moment, they tried to contact the monarchy, asking for a protection law to prevent witch hunts, because in practice, even though few wizards died in witch hunts.
What happened most often was that Muggles were mistaken for wizards and burned because there was no way to escape.
The more experienced wizards who were captured would freeze the flames of the pyres, making them simply tickle, like Wendelin the Weird, who even let herself get captured several times to do this because she thought it was fun.
So, among the wizards, the ones who died were mostly the young and inexperienced.
So, since this was a big problem, wizards also saw it as part of their responsibility that muggles were being killed because of magic they weren't even capable of doing. So, they asked the monarchy for help, but they completely ignore it. It was exactly King William III and Queen Mary II.
This also contributed to wizards creating the International Statute of Secrecy in magic. These here are some of the most notable names who held the position of Chief of the Wizards' Council in the time before the Ministry of Magic. Barbaros Braid was indirectly responsible for creating the position of Seeker in the game of Quidditch, because he simply released a golden snidget during a match.
There was no position, which was initially called Hunter, and he promised a prize of 150 galleons to whoever managed to capture the bird.
This led to the bird being included in all games, and the Hunter position was created, which later became the Seeker.
Burdock Munden was a chief who even had good intentions, but didn't know how to get things done.
He tried to establish what was a being and what was an animal, and ended up causing a big mess.
Elfrida Clegg was a very important chief, because she was the one who, in a way, fixed the stupidity that Barbaros Braid did by releasing a creature on a Quidditch field.
The golden snidget nearly went extinct due to Barbaros Braid, as the creature was used in games and killed each time it was caught.
She then creates a sanctuary for golden snidgets and bans their use in games. And then, that's where the creation of the golden snitch comes in. Back in the 13th century, with Bowman Wright, who actually lived in Godric's Hollow. He was an exceptional wizard, a metal charmer, who created the snitch by reproducing the movements of the golden snidget. And then comes Lickgamp, who was the last head of the Wizards' Council. He was already part of the transition to the Ministry of Magic and, in fact, was chosen as the first Minister for Magic during his term. Lickgamp had to deal with a very divided wizarding society.
Many opposed the statute, while others supported it. Tempers flared. Many were frightened by this new measure.
And then he had to deal with it, being the Minister for Magic at that time, in the year 1707, which was when the ministry was formally established. And then, still during his term, it was Lickgamp who made the Cruciatus, Imperius, and Avada Kedavra curses unforgivable. That happened in 1717, a year before he left office in 1718.
If in the past, the wizarding government was not successful in contacting the Muggle government, here in this period, things change a bit.
Because after the Muggles stopped being an absolute monarchy, they became a parliamentary monarchy. The position with the most political power, in practice, became that of the Prime Minister, which, at the time it was created, didn't even officially have that name. It was First Lord of the Treasury, or Chancellor of the Treasury, and it came about in 1721 sometime later, right? There was a period before that position was created, so that's when the wizards managed to make contact with the Muggle government, but this time, not to ask for protection, but rather the Minister for Magic reaching out to the Muggle Prime Minister to say, look, we're here, we exist, and we have our own government. If anything happens, we'll let you know. If there's anything that poses a risk to your people, we'll get in touch. And also, the wizarding government had the responsibility to make sure that the Muggle government, the head of the British Muggle government, would misinform their people about matters of magic. So, if something happened, like, I don't know, a dragon was spotted, the wizards would step in, erase memories, and change things for those involved. But the leader of the Muggle government needed to make a statement. If things got out of control, he had to say something, so he would make something up.
I'm just guessing, but he'd probably call it a toy or something. I'm not saying that's what really happened, that he said it was a toy, but it was something like that.
You had to mislead people and spread harmless fake news to avoid exposing the wizarding world.
After all, no one in such an important position, with that kind of power, would risk saying it was a real dragon or real magic, because they'd be considered crazy and lose their position. But an important point is, the contact didn't happen right away. In 1721, between the Minister for Magic and the first Muggle Prime Minister, because in 1718, the person who took over as Minister for Magic was a guy named Damocles Hall, who had a completely anti-Muggle policy. Forget about him speaking to the first Muggle Prime Minister, who didn't have that title then. And after Damocles Hall, who, just as a curiosity, was the one who established Azkaban as a prison full of Dementors, after him, the person who took over as Minister for Magic was a guy named Perseus Parkinson, who even tried to ban marriages between wizards and muggles.
But the wizarding community was tired of this anti-muggle sentiment, this whole thing, so he ended up losing his position.
Why did I have to say all this to get here? Because this is our guy, the key figure in this video's story. Eldritch Diggory takes over the government in 1733, the Ministry of Magic in 1733.
And why? Most likely, he was the one who established the connection with the Muggle Prime Minister, because in 1721, when the position of Muggle Prime Minister was created, Downing Street was not yet the official residence of the person holding the position, right?
Because the Prime Minister lives at number 10 Downing Street, the Muggle Prime Minister. Every acting minister lives there.
But that only happened in 1735, and since Eldritch Diggory took over the Ministry of Magic in 1733, and we know that the Minister of Magic contacts the Muggle Prime Minister, Eldritch Diggory's predecessors had an anti-Muggle campaign, so they wouldn't have had that contact.
This guy likely made that contact. That shows how important he was, okay?
Why is he important in this episode here? Because he was a completely decent guy.
He had nothing against Muggles, no anti-Muggle policies, no anti-mixed blood policies, nothing like that.
And yes, before you ask because of the name, he is very likely an ancestor of Cedric Diggory, so he is probably the one who establishes this contact with the first Muggle Prime Minister. And even today, up to the present day, in the office of the Muggle Prime Minister, there is a portrait of Ulrich Gemp, who was the first Minister for Magic, who was the head of the Wizards' Council, and then, during the transition, became the first Minister for Magic. And this portrait is the one that informs the Muggle Prime Minister.
When the current Minister for Magic goes to visit, they go to the office to say something.
In fact, his fireplace is connected to the Flu network, so that the Minister for Magic can appear there.
One of the things that marked Eldritch Diggory's administration was that he also tried to remove the Dementors from Azkaban.
After visiting the prison and seeing the conditions the inmates lived in, which were completely inhumane, with prisoners driven to insanity, sometimes for crimes that weren't even that serious, he tries to remove them and sets up a committee to get them out. But we know that doesn't happen, since the Dementors are still there in the future. The fact is that Eldritch Diggory was also responsible for creating the Auror recruitment program. That's why we're talking about him in this episode. He created this recruitment program to train these wizards and have a sort of police force to fight crime in general in the wizarding world.
So, the Auror headquarters is created, and it was located on the second floor of the Ministry of Magic.
The same floor as the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, which, by the way, is the department responsible for the Auror headquarters, right? The Auror headquarters is a division of that department. Who was the first Auror at the British Ministry of Magic? We don't know who the first one was, but we do know who one of the first was. And that guy's name is Hephaestus Gore.
We don't know much about his time as an Auror, but in 1752, after a career of almost 20 years as an Auror, he became Minister for Magic. He was chosen as Minister for Magic, and as Minister for Magic, this guy was pretty tough.
He successfully contained the Goblin Rebellion that joined forces with werewolves at the time. But he did this in a very violent way, so the success he achieved in suppressing these rebellions wasn't really a success for everyone. It was for the wizards who oppressed these other beings.
Anyway, he was a very combative guy, but he held his position and, among other things, he promoted broom races and so on.
There's even a portrait of Hephaestus at the Ministry of Magic over in the Auror section.
At some point, he lost both legs.
Over the years, the Auror recruitment program has been improved, right? Because nothing is born perfect. Everything gets refined over time, and a lot of it comes from the government as well. I repeat, it's a reflection of the times, and according to each leader, things would change. The Auror headquarters, as I said, was under the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, but it had its own chief.
And now, what does it take to become an Auror? How do you do it? What does a wizard have to do? How does that work?
Well, first of all, it starts back in academic life, at school.
In the 5th year, specifically, the student needs to get at least 5 owls, which are required. Owls are the ordinary wizarding levels they take in the 5th year, and they need to get at least 5. Why these 5 subjects, which are specific disciplines that I'll mention? Out of these 5, they need to take the newts. They can only take the newts, attend, and sit for the newts if they get the owls in the 5th year. And the 5 suggested subjects are Defense Against the Dark Arts, Transfiguration, Charms, Potions, and Herbology. And the grade can't be below exceeds expectations, which is equivalent to an 8 or 9. So, the student takes and gets the owls, then takes and gets the newts, which are the nastily exhausting wizarding tests, which are already the advanced level, for students to graduate from Hogwarts, and they take them in the 7th year.
And then, with these grades, the wizard can apply for the program, but that doesn't mean they'll get in, because they also need to have a clean record, no problems with the law.
The Auror training course is very demanding, very difficult. It lasts for 3 years, and most of the wizards who enroll do not complete this training.
The students were subjected to numerous exhausting tests of character and aptitude, and the obvious goal of these tests was to prepare them, right?
Not only to prepare them, but also to see how they reacted under pressure, in situations they might actually face.
Some of the subjects that were part of this long 3-year training included concealment and disguise.
The name already says what happens, right? The student had to disguise themselves there, to hide, basically a witch's camouflage. And the one who did really well in this test was Tonks, while she was training to be an Auror because she was a metamorph magus, right?
So she used her own gift there and did really well. Another subject, stealth and tracking. Obviously, an Auror who is investigating something needs stealth.
He won't show up making a fuss. Most of the time, he can't even be noticed or perceived.
And in this, Tonks failed a bit because she was very clumsy. But even so, she managed to get a high enough score to pass.
Instinct in battle. Of course, an Auror, besides having knowledge and a lot of study, also needs instinct. And this instinct is developed and trained in this discipline.
Elaborate planning is also one, so they can develop tactics. Learn to develop tactics, right? To use in operations. Duels in the dark. Yeah, the conditions won't always be favorable when facing a criminal wizard. So wizards need to train for different situations. And one of them is dueling in the dark. It must be incredibly cool, man. I'm talking as if it actually existed, right? Considering the context, it must be cool.
Field training is a more comprehensive kind of training, in terms of endurance. You know, physical endurance. Because even if you don't think so, wizards need physical endurance.
And another very important thing they learn is the history of the dark arts.
For you to defeat your enemies, for you to succeed, you need to have a foundation, to know the history of what they use, so it's important.
And there's also a subject in the Auror training program that was introduced after a great Auror was killed, right? And it's known as the Mad Eye Method. And the students had to stand for an hour defending themselves from spells like that, exhaustively. So of course, they improved their ability to defend themselves, right?
Imagine a full hour of non-stop spells, with experienced Aurors casting and someone having to defend themselves.
They also had poisons and antidotes, because that's really important, right?
After all, we know that not only spells can cause harm, but potions can be used as well. They often used advanced transfiguration there, as Aurors frequently transfigured and disguised themselves.
That touches on concealment and disguise, which involves more than just advanced transfiguration, though advanced transfiguration is a part of it.
It's tough. Few people pass or finish it. Each government is responsible for its own Aurors, for its security force, and Aurors only have jurisdiction within their own countries, in case something happens. And they are assigned to collaborate with another country, that's fine. But an Auror can't go to another country without being assigned to do so. It can happen. So an Auror, a North American Auror, could end up going to Europe to investigate something if he's assigned to do so by his department, but on his own, no.
In fact, in extreme cases, like during the Global War, when Grindelwald was trying to dominate the Muggles, the Aurors joined forces, right?
There were Aurors from the United Kingdom, Aurors from the United States, Aurors from France, all of them united in an attempt to try to contain Grindelwald. In fact, the Auror Department of Magical Congress of the United States of America is older than the Auror Department of the British Ministry of Magic. Because the first president of the United States, the first wizard president of the United States, who was Josiah Jackson, his priority was to establish this recruitment of Aurors, because specifically in North America, things were very intense.
Crime was very intense, especially with the Scourers, who were wizards that hunted other wizards in exchange for gold, and would purposely marry Muggles to purge magic from their bloodline. And in the United States, the first Aurors were called the Original 12, right? The 12 original Aurors, who were the guys that made history for being the brave ones who volunteered for it, because nobody else wanted to. Among them was Abraham Potter, who wizard genealogists later found was related to Harry. But don't think everything is perfect, because Aurors answer to the government, and the government isn't always right.
Like during the time of the Global Wizarding War, when the German Ministry of Magic was taken over, there was a coup and the Aurors were the foundation of that coup.
Helmut, head of Aurors at the German Ministry of Magic, helped take over the ministry, where the head of the International Confederation of Wizards, which is the entity, the body above all ministries, right? All the ministries in the world answer to the International Confederation of Wizards. The supreme head, which is the highest position of power among wizards, declared there. Who was Anton Vogel? Declared that Grindelwald was innocent. He was innocent of the charges, allowing him to run for the position of supreme head. And the Aurors of the German Ministry of Magic were mainly responsible for fighting and arresting opponents and sending them to secret prisons, like Erkstag. In the British Ministry of Magic, we see something similar happening because when Voldemort regains his strength, right there, during the period that became known as the Second Wizarding War, and the Ministry of Magic, led by Fudge, takes a denialist stance regarding Voldemort's return. The Aurors are being used to carry out the Minister's wishes. And in this case, we see the Aurors going to Hogwarts trying to arrest Dumbledore. They try to arrest Hagrid. They attack Minerva McGonagall, and she ends up hospitalized because of it. But these are specific periods, right?
There were great Aurors, including during the First Wizarding War, when the Aurors played a very important role in fighting the Dark Wizards, the Death Eaters, trying to fight Voldemort at that time. But even with all the training, even being prepared for it, they didn't have the necessary knowledge to fight against Voldemort.
Because it's a very militarized thing, very closed off, that doesn't accept things coming from outside, so they ended up not accepting it. For example, during Grindelwald's era, Torquil Travers, who was the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, would send the Aurors on missions and allow the use of violence. You know? So, these repressive and violent policies from the Aurors ended up inflaming the wizarding community even more, which fell for Grindelwald's rhetoric, because Grindelwald would say, "No, look, we are the peaceful ones. We are. No, we are not violent."
It's the wizarding government itself that's violent and comes here and kills the people who are after the truth, who are here seeking freedom.
Privately, he wanted to dominate and enslave Muggles and commit many atrocities.
In the end, the Aurors end up becoming pawns on a chessboard, while the truly powerful ones control them.
But there have been great Aurors. Most of them were people who truly fought for good, who fought against those things. One of the greatest names among the Aurors was definitely Alastor Moody. The guy was simply unbeatable. He filled Azkaban during the First Wizarding War, and his career as an Auror cost him body parts, right? He lost a leg, lost an eye, lost a piece of his nose, and after he retired, he became really paranoid. No wonder, right? Alastor Moody was Nymphadora Tonks's mentor when she was in her Auror training program, and Tonks was one of the only ones to graduate as an Auror after the First Wizarding War, right?
Most of them couldn't finish the course, and then we go back to the period of the Second Wizarding War.
Not during the government's denialist period, because the government ends up falling when Voldemort is confirmed to be real, right? When his return is confirmed to be real.
So, Rufus Scrimgeour, who was the head of the Auror department at the time, takes over as Minister for Magic because the government's thinking is, hey, he's the head of the Aurors, so he knows how to fight against the dark arts.
He becomes Minister for Magic without a vote, just taking the position. In Crises, this happens in the wizarding world. He becomes Minister for Magic, is quickly assassinated, and the Ministry of Magic is taken over. Pius Thicknessa, who was the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, is put under the Imperious Curse. The Death Eaters start building an infiltrated network in the Ministry of Magic. They kill Rufus Scrimgeour, and then Pius Thicknessa takes over the ministry as a puppet minister, because the one really in charge was Voldemort and the Death Eaters. Then, Corbin Yaxley takes over the Department of Magical Law Enforcement.
And the Muggleborn Registration Commission is created in order to oppress Muggleborns, to torture them, imprison them, and simply run a false campaign claiming that Muggleborns were capable of stealing magic.
During this period, the Auror headquarters is closed. It is simply shut down. Some are kept at the Ministry of Magic, like Kingsglaze, Shacklebolt, Nymphadora, Tonks, because they wanted to keep them close, to watch them, because they knew they had some connection to the Resistance. And it was only after the fall of Voldemort, right? When he was finally defeated at the Battle of Hogwarts. And the Ministry of Magic changed. It had a new face. Kingsglaze Shacklebolt takes over as Minister of Magic, and then things change. Kingsglaze revolutionizes the way of governing the Ministry of Magic. He eradicates laws that favored pro-pure blood campaigns, and, together with a new team, a new staff in specific positions, he ends up making this big reform, and he reopens the Auror headquarters and brings back those who fought in the Battle of Hogwarts. He loosens up the Auror recruitment program a bit. He makes it less strict, and declares that anyone who fought in the Battle of Hogwarts, who survived the Battle of Hogwarts without giving in to the temptation to switch sides, and was of age, obviously, was fully qualified to participate in the Auror training. So, Harry Potter and Ron Weasley leave without finishing school, graduating, or getting their nastily exhausting wizarding test S. They go there for recruitment. Neville Longbottom goes for recruitment, and Ron and Neville stay there for a short time. Neville stays for a short time.
He later applies for the herbology teacher position at Hogwarts, is accepted, and Ron remains there for about 2 years.
And then he retires and goes to help his brother, George, at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. He ends up managing Weasley's Wizard Wheezes together with his brother. As for Harry, he builds his career in the Auror department, and in 2007, he becomes the head of the Auror department. In 2014, he had a scar on his cheek, another scar that he got during his career, during the time he was fighting against the dark arts as an Auror. Several times people tried to ask him, tried to get information about how he got that scar, like Rita Skeeter, for example. But Harry stated that, as he had already said 542 times, Auror matters were not revealed, were not shared with the Daily Prophet, especially with Rita Skeeter. In 2020, after nearly 20 years in his career, Harry was promoted to head of the Auror department, the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, just below the Minister for Magic, who was Hermione Granger at the time, right? At Auror headquarters, Harry and Ron also revolutionized the Auror program. They revolutionized the way the program worked there, and they put an end to corruption at the Auror headquarters. Meanwhile, Kingsley Shacklebolt, who re-established the Auror program after the Second War, managed to remove the Dementors from Azkaban and replace the old prison guards with Aurors.
In other words, he has a certain connection with Eldritch Diggory, because Eldritch Diggory tried to remove the Dementors, but he couldn't, since the committee he established stayed there. He died in office, he contracted dragonpox, he died in office, and so it didn't move forward.
In fact, there's a suspicion that his death from dragonpox was actually some people wanting to remove him from power, because he was very pro-Muggle, you know? So, Kingsley Shacklebolt manages to restore the Auror program, which was established by Eldritch Diggory, and he manages to accomplish what Eldritch Diggory tried back in 1733, which was to remove the Dementors from Azkaban. He only does that in 1998. But don't think that Aurors are the only security force in the wizarding world.
No, long before the Aurors, even before the Ministry of Magic existed, there were already elite wizards who are rarely mentioned, but they are wizards who take part in very extreme actions, like the capture of Sirius Black, for example.
The elite wizards are part of the Magical Law Enforcement Squad. These wizards are trained there to deal with extreme situations, and they have existed since before the ministry was founded. They come from the Wizards Council, as a part of the Wizards Council, which also remained there at the founding of the ministry, which is the Supreme Court of Wizards. The Supreme Court of Wizards was already part of the council, and still exists today, right? The Department of Magical Law Enforcement was the first department established, followed by the Supreme Court of Wizards and elite wizards from that early government era before the Ministry of Magic.
But they are mentioned very few times and are sometimes called in as backup for the Aurors.
This group existed before the International Statute of Secrecy and Magic was enacted in 1692. But that's it. That was our journey through time, history, magic, and the universe of Harry Potter. I hope you enjoyed learning about how the Aurors came to be, how the ministry was created, and a bit about this political side of the wizarding world. If you liked it, don't forget to leave your like. All the content in this episode is official and canonical.
It comes from J.K. Rowling's books, texts on the Harry Potter website, formerly Pottermore, and some franchise games. Thank you for watching. See you next episode of The Leaky Cauldron, Mischief Managed.